King Manasseh, King Ahab, and King Jeroboam. And he said they're great Torah scholars, but they were sinners. So he goes off and he prepares his teaching, and that night, King Manasseh comes into his dream and says, hey, wait a minute, who do you think you are? Saying that you're at the same level as us and that we're sinners. And he says, King Manasseh, you were chasing idols. Tell me why you chased idols. And King Manasseh said, in my time, idols were such a powerful force. If you were in my time, you would have chased after them yourself, right? And the idea there is, and there's a lot of tradition behind that idea, but the idea is that unless you live through that situation, it always looks cleaner and simpler in reverse. We talked about that last week in the Holocaust. Why didn't they run? They didn't know how far it was going, right? You can do this in every time, but it's very easy to look back on those time periods and judge them. Thankfully, we have two mitzvot to us that we can employ here. One is the benefit of doubt. It's a Musar ethic. It's the idea that we give someone the benefit of doubt. And that's what we're going to do today. And the other one is basically assuming that I would have done worse if I were in that situation, right? Just being a little humble. I want to look at the rabbis. What was going on in that first century? Why was there so much argument? I think that there's a lot of misreading, misinterpreting, and even assuming negative intent. And we'll talk about where that comes from and how pervasive that is. But I want to look at this first week. We're going to do a brush over of the history that led to the first century, which is, of course, the New Testament, right? It encapsulates the New Testament. And then next week, I want to go into the New Testament arguments and show you how that played into the arguments and why there's so much more going on in those discussions than people see on the surface. And I think hopefully by the end of this, we'll have a little bit new perspective. This could be a very intense semester or longer if we were to go through, because virtually every discussion in the New Testament, every argument of Paul, every argument of Yeshua and whoever, ties back to this context and actually a deep Jewish halakhic discussion. And if you don't know that, it seems very simple. It seems like the rabbis are the bad guys, the villains, right? Of course, history has borne that out. So here's my objective: to provide deeper insight into the context of the New Testament. And I want to look at the nature of, the reasons for, and the goal of the early rabbinic disputes, namely those that we see in the Gospels. I'm going to stick with the Gospels. Paul gets a little more complicated. We haven't really built the foundation for that yet. We've only touched on it at times. The Gospels might be a good place to start. Yeah. Ready?
Yeah.
Ready. I thought I saw a hand up already. All right, so we're going to go through a quick outline. Modern misconceptions. We're going to do a brief history of the late Second Temple era, the major streams of Jewish expression, cultural influence, sectarianism, and then we're going to wrap up with rabbinic concerns. What were they concerned about at this time? Why were they arguing, and why was it such a big deal? And then a little brush over the post-temple reboot. Why that era? I'll just say this at the outset. The first century is gone to history. Doesn't exist anymore. That context led to the rebooting of Judaism, but Judaism itself has looked back on that first century as almost tragic in how divisive it was. And it fixed those in the next generation. So when people say, oh, we should go back to the first century, like, good luck. In fact, I think that there's a lot that we can't go back to at this point. I think that's fine. Okay, modern misconceptions. I'm not going to judge you. What comes to mind when you see these words? Just shout them out. The rabbis, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, rabbinic literature. What's the feeling you get from those?
Well, good from the rabbis.
Politically expedient. Lloyd, just like you're about to say something.
What do you say?
Politics, okay.
Oh, that's good.
Would you say, and this is, maybe this is a broader social, religious, social perspective, are the rabbis and the Pharisees seen as like pious, positive people, or are they negative? Harsh? And if you're Jewish and you came through a Christian perspective, you probably carried those over. Right?
I grew up I guess hearing the harsh verdict on the Pharisees, the sages. It was always John 8 that did it for me, like when there was that little stoning that they were going to convene, and everybody's like, that's so barbaric. And it's like, well, wait, they're doing exactly what God told them to do, and so like, wait, these guys can't be the villains you're casting them as if they're simply doing what they would have been cursed for not doing, and that was like the thread that I pulled that kind of unraveled those guys as being the villains, or the.
Sure, villains. I think that's very common. Go ahead, Lloyd.
Wait. So when I see the word Pharisee, if I'm reading and the Pharisees are from Galilee, they seem very open to listening. But if I see the Pharisees as from Judea, they're more of argument. I can't say word.
Argumentative. Okay, but that's very astute, though, that you did notice that they are kind of all over the place. Bev, your hand. So.
When I see rabbis in rabbinic literature, I get one kind of feeling, like a positive, good feeling. And I don't put them in the same context. When I see the Pharisees, I just think a negative context. And when I see the Sadducees, I mean, this is just me, but I remember that little bitty. They were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. And to me, that was the thing.
John is right, because the rabbis of the Talmud are the Pharisees. Basically, that's the surviving sect of Judaism.
Yeah.
And I think the Pharisees have gotten the worst rap ever because of what the Christian church has done to that. And there's still, like, people will still say, don't be a Pharisee. Like, they use it in modern context. I'm offended every time I hear it. I hate that. And the Sadducees, like Bev said, I do think it's kind of sad because of what they didn't believe. Like, they didn't believe in the life of God. I believe that. I do think it's sad, actually.
Yeah, so Brad won. I'm going to move on to the next slide here because Brad pulled this out. The idea of the word Pharisee is typically used as a derogatory term, right? You're being such a Pharisee.
Doesn't it mean you're fair, you see?
I think it does. I think you're right. Well, David, okay.
Yeshua said he didn't, those who are healthy have no need for a physician, but those who are sick do, and he has not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So there was righteous Pharisees. The problem is like this. The first time a lot of people ever meet a Jew is the Pharisees who needed a physician, who needed a healer, who needed repentance, and they assume every Pharisee was not righteous.
Yeah, so very good. So there were Pharisees among the believing body. We see that all throughout. Not just Paul. There were many. And it's okay. We'll talk about the Pharisees. We've brushed over them in the past. We have a lot of videos on YouTube if you want to go back through them. It was a very diverse group, but they weren't even the majority. Pharisees, as the Talmud describes them, are sort of another subsect at the time, we'll get into this shortly, there were 24 different groups the Talmud counts. That's a lot, right? So modern misconceptions. Knowledge of the historical, social, and religious context is severely lacking. Right? We've seen what happens down the road. When people assume the Pharisees are bad, the rabbis are bad, guess what? The Jews are bad, and we can see how that turns into anti-Semitism. People still use those today. Even people with large podcast platforms, they still pull these same verses out of the New Testament, completely decontextualized, completely without awareness of the religious context. It's very persistent. 2, the opinions of Judaism as a result are based on the polemics. Now, is that a great way to introduce any idea through a polemic? A polemic is like, I'm going to prove how bad this is by my argument, right? Like you're starting off in the ground burying this idea. Dunning-Kruger effect. Does anyone know what that is?
No.
I feel like you would know, Drake. Go ahead.
I think studies have indicated that the less people know about a specific topic, the more confident they feel that they have insight into it, or that everybody's a keyboard PhD.
Yeah. So good. So Dunning-Kruger is this psychological condition where you know a little bit about something, and it makes you believe you know all you need to know about that something. I've been, and I'm not going to name names, but I've been in church sermons or teaching situations where the pastor would say, "Oh, the Jews believed this," and it was completely wrong. I'm not going to make a scene. Sometimes I might say, hey, this is actually wrong, and if you're interested. But it's the idea that because I read an argument in the New Testament, I know what Jews believe, and they all believe you can't heal on Shabbat. We're going to talk about that one next week, which is why we need this week to build to that. When you combine that with attribution error, which is another idea that I think that these people are generally bad and they're out to get Jesus or whatever, then you get vilification. So Judaism, the rabbis, rabbinic literature, Midrash, the Talmud, all of these things have come through these filters, which is vilified. I find myself often in these situations where I'll cite something from a rabbinic source and I'll get a number of rebuttals of why I shouldn't read that source or what the rabbis believe. And it's interesting because I'm very deeply in these texts and I don't see that. Where did that idea come from? It's this like stair step. The conclusion is that Yeshua is anti-tradition and anti-Judaism. Very interesting, right? Now, thankfully, we can laugh at that here, but there are places I would be kicked out right about at this point. I would be removed from the room at this point. Okay, so hint, there's a lot more going on in these discussions than we know, and it's humbling when we realize the background to them. Historical overview. So how did we get there? Why was the first century such a mess? And this is not the scale. I just had to make this time period fit. We had the Babylonian exile, right? They were taken out of Israel, different phases, sent into Babylon, had to live among a different culture, had to find a way to survive. How do you keep your traditions? How do you keep the essence of what it means to be Israel when you're surrounded by these other nations? After the exile, we get this protracted, slow return of people. It's a trickle at various times. It swells a little bit more, but it's a slow return to Jerusalem. The temple's rebuilt about 516. And I want to show you, these are the cultures that the Jewish people had to live under. And a lot of these are Greek, in essence, Hellenistic, if you will. These are all the cultures that they had to navigate. And some things are the same, but some things are very different. They had to then build fences around how you keep kashrut. How do you keep Shabbat when the culture is doing something different, right? Everything that they came into contact caused issues in everyday life for Jewish people. Now, in some cases worse than others. Of course, we remember we had the Maccabean revolt here where they absolutely didn't want any Torah, any tradition at all, right? Like we know the Hanukkah story. Okay, so this is the situation. Anytime a culture bumps into other cultures or lives among another culture, there's going to be influence of some level. And more if you don't do something about it. New reality in the first century. By the time we get to the first century, we had more Jews living outside of Israel than within. How does that work? These people come back for the festivals, mostly, and they bring, we'll talk about an example in a minute, but they bring with them other stuff, other ideas, other influences. How does that work if you live in Israel? Right? I remember reading after a festival, the temple precinct would be completely cleaned for purity's sake, because all these people coming and touching everything, they had to clean it, because a lot of these people live in pagan nations. Purity is a big issue. New ideas and developments returned with the Jews in this time. And Rabbi Peter hinted at this last time. We see synagogues. Synagogues seem to have come from somewhere in the Babylonian exile. Makes great sense. But what happens when you bring those back into a place that has a temple? Who's in charge now? How do they work together? It seems like they had to do some work to make the temple its own distinct thing now that we have a local synagogue. And by the way, the emphasis on tradition. So I just recently had a conversation with somebody who was very adamant that I shouldn't be looking at rabbinic tradition. Okay, you get that a lot. How do you manage a synagogue? What chapter of the Bible tells you how to set up a synagogue? Why is it that we go through, we were in Israel a couple years ago, Aaron. We go to see these various synagogues, and they're all laid out the same way. They're all pointing in the same way. They're generally structured, no matter where you go at this time period. Even today, a synagogue that's dedicated and built is still built by some tradition. When Yeshua goes into a synagogue, which seems to indicate that he was for it, right? He goes and he reads the Torah. He reads from Isaiah, and he gives kind of a mini drash. It might have been before the era of the drash picked up. But he was explaining in sort of a drash form what he just read. Where did he learn that? Right? So you get my point. So we have holidays and festivals, and how do you keep Passover Seder? There's so much tradition that's inherent in Jewish life, it's impossible to do without tradition. Or you'll see these other cultures, these Jewish cultures who got too far out, like the Elephantine community in Egypt. They had really adopted so much of the local Egyptian culture that they faded away. They're kind of this use case of what happens when you don't hold tradition. And that can happen very easily today. So tradition comes back. How to navigate living among non-Jewish pagans comes back with them. Ezra and Nehemiah made some massive shifts, which people take for granted, but that was a big deal. The growing Babylonian Jewish community would become important in the future. That would be where a lot of Jews escaped the Roman oppression later and after the Jewish-Roman War. But all of these cultures led to a lot of discussions about how to keep Torah when the Romans are doing this or when the Greeks are doing this, right? And compile that over centuries, and you get volumes that look like the Talmud back there, a couple shelves of it, right? Because the Bible doesn't explain these things to you. There's an idea in, I think, the Christian world that the Bible is God's gift to people, right? Great. The Jewish world says the same thing, but our gift to God is how we participate, and we make that part of our lives, and we build fences, and we incorporate it into our tradition, and door to door, we say it every week, generation by generation. It's a participatory model. It's not enough to just have it and read it. How we respond to that, revelation, is in essence what the tradition should be built on. Okay. So, just an overview. Post-Babylon, new era. We're in some new territory. Angels start to have names now. You'll start to see Gabriel and Michael. You'll see these angels that they had a little bit more depth to them before. They might have just been angels, Malachim. Now they're starting to kind of develop a little more. Through the successive influence of these cultures, the leadership from the Hasmoneans, when Rabbi Peter taught on the Hanukkah story, sadly the Hasmoneans faded into political expediency themselves. They became very problematic. The Herodians, all these groups that somehow took over were trying to get their own power base established. That left a problem for the everyday people, especially those who were religious. The temple leadership was now under the Sadducees, and the rabbinic literature shares how famously bad they were at observing things to the proper degree. Even in the Torah, right? There's a lot of trouble with the way the Sadducees ran the temple, but guess what? They are in control of it, so you have to deal with them. And at the end of all of this, we have the everyday people are just getting trampled, right? They don't have a lot of leadership.
I would just add that the temple control just in general is actually kind of weird in the sense that the Jerusalem temple is controlled by the Sadducees, the priests, how they overlap and such as. We also have temples in Egypt that are run completely off kilter, and they're actually living with realities of these alternate temples that are way outside of Torah itself, and yet they're still calling themselves Jewish and all this kind of stuff as well. It's
Samaritans.
Yeah, well, not the Anias and then the one at Elephantine. There are at least two different, and the Elephantine one was destroyed and rebuilt, and so you've got a bunch of this stuff happening in the same time period as well.
Yeah. Did you have something to say, Brian? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Yeshua says salvation comes from the Elephantine, okay, that's right. So the New Testament shows you which side it's for, and they also show that the Sadducees weren't loved. Right? So in this time, because of the people, you had the Pharisees in the century before, the proto-Pharisees, the proto-rabbis. They start to move into this space to try to help people learn how to keep Torah from the ground level, right? And they would have clashes with the Sadducees. And anyone who's doing the Sent Ones, the Torah Club, it's talking about that. it was a political battle to see how many Pharisees you could get in the Sanhedrin or in that leadership space to kind of take control of it, because the everyday people were not learning at the rate that they could have. I'll move through these quickly. The Roman occupation just increased tension. You have economic oppression. You have cultural and religious impacts. We'll look at an example in a second. All of these were new obstacles to keeping yourself pure. Rabbi Peter did a teaching on purity, spiritual purity and physical purity. How do you keep yourself pure when you are giving taxes to pagans, right? A lot of problems with that. Go ahead, Izzy.
I also wanted to add that a lot of times the corruption in leadership also kind of spilled into literature, and you had all these different leaders that were like kind of controlling religion, manipulating what used to be like good literature that talked about religion and manipulating it to the way so they can get more power, which happened a lot in like the early medieval era with the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so that's hijacking or reinterpreting what Scripture means for your own benefit. That's a very human problem. Very good.
Well, one thing you're mentioning right there is, paying taxes. It's like you essentially now have two tax codes, which you never did before. And so this presents a dilemma, because it's like I have to make this maaser, this to the temple. It's like, well, after I pay our oppressors, which I have to do first, how much of that do I actually have left to live on and actually fulfill the mitzvah? And so some of these are real dilemmas.
They're real dilemmas.
Yeah.
Now, where does the Bible tell you the answer to that? It doesn't, because it was always about Moses passing the tradition down, remember? And Pirkei Avot starts off with that. Now, of course, Pirkei Avot is after the temple destruction. That's when that surviving sect is reorganizing everything under this idea. But the idea of passing tradition on verbally was persistent. We see it. We see it all throughout the Bible. Those are new problems that you now have to take it, and I'll show you in, I think, 2 slides. You have to take this Torah precedent, and through much discussion and debate, you have to figure out an actual practical way to live that out. And then if this situation changes, that's another discussion. How do we get back to that? Of course, naturally, because of all these influences, you're going to have a lot of influence in sectarianism in your own communities. You're going to have people who disagree. And when it is down to rabbinic disputes, you might like someone else you might like this answer better than that answer. You've got a rift. And that's why I think there were 24 at the least in Israel alone. Imagine how crazy that looked when you get to the diaspora. Almost every community could have its own micro discussions and disputations. Brad, you would go to Rome from Galatia, and you would have a completely different, what do you guys, we don't do things that way. Right? That's the reality you're looking at. So this contributed to a lot of confusion. And then, of course, do we resolve it or do we revolt? And you see that in the first century. Right? Okay. Major concerns, grouping all these into just 2. Hellenistic influence. So for hundreds of years, the Greeks posed a very unique problem for the Jewish people. It's very easy to ignore cultures that are less learned, less educated. They're more warring cultures. But the Greeks had their own ideas and philosophy, and that was very appealing to some people. Especially for the learned people in Israel, there's another culture that's got libraries, and they study and they debate. Wow, right? So it's very easy to see how these could pose a new problem.
This specifically Hellenistic is the Macedonian version of Greek. It's the Alexander the Great. So it was Hellenic before that. But yeah, so this is, they kept parts of that, but like you mentioned the warring part.
Yeah.
Definitely the warring part.
But I would say the Greek problem, I'll say 2 things. Number 1, the Greek problem persists in Judaism even through Maimonides, the Middle Ages. Right? He's very Greek influenced. The other problem that you have is that the Greeks probably did the most damage to Judaism over time, more than any culture. And in some ways, this is kind of my take, Christianity is presented more Hellenistically than it is Torah-based. So it's another influence from the realm of Hellenism. Go ahead, Drew.
Well, something very interesting about the Greek culture and the fact that it wasn't just polytheism they brought over. They brought over science, skepticism. At this time in history, you started to see, like in the Athenian Golden Age, like many of the Greeks didn't necessarily, they kind of stopped believing in the old gods. They started being very skeptical, believing in science, believing in reason, logic. They were building simple clocks. I mean, it was a high civilization. We have the Antikythera clock. It's a bronze clock that was built. But that had to have been very appealing, because I think a lot of people think, when they think of the word modernity, they think of right now.
Yeah.
Where there have been in human history a lot of modernities coming up like hills, in which there's a skeptical, sort of secular, science-based, affluent society that maybe doesn't have as many kids, things like that, and they kind of look down on their fathers before them, or and that they were going up against literal modernity, not just another occupier. I think that's why they had such purchase over the Jewish culture.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think Drake is one of our most knowledgeable of the Greek culture. If you ever want to go deeper on this, Drake's your guy. I think when you look at the early phase, when the Torah was translated into the Greek, it seemed early on there really wasn't a major problem with that. It became a problem later. But there was so much influence of the Greek, and the Jewish people were in the Roman Empire, and they probably, you see in the New Testament, it's almost always referring to Greeks in the community. Very persistent, and even still today, some of the ideas, we went to D.C., I still consider our family patriots, but a lot of the architecture, our government system, is not Torah-based, right? Where do these come from? It's the most persistent. So when you're under Hellenistic influence, you have to start building structured learning as to how you separate the two. And this is where the rabbis, the Pharisees, really lived out, and they controlled the domain of the communities, as you were saying, Lloyd, in the Galilee, wherever. They were fanned out, and the synagogue became their kind of like their place of learning and teaching. One of the big concerns they had was purity. So just obviously simple Torah learning, simple historical, here's who you are, here's why this matters. But everyday purity was a real problem. You can be in your community, but when you go down the street and you have to purchase from a stand, which is decorated for some pagan holiday, what do? Right? Bible doesn't tell you that. That's fine. It didn't leave us in a lurch. It gave us a system to figure those things out. But at this particular time, this is pre-Mishnah. The Mishnah, I would say, is a reaction to this very sectarian, dispute-heavy time period. Pre-Mishnah, you just debated it out among leaders, among learned people. And naturally, in the first century, interactions with Gentiles, who, by the way, were almost entirely pagans at the time, we've said that before, would be a vector for all of these disputes about purity. So it wasn't that the rabbis hated Gentiles. I've heard pastors say that. They despised Gentiles. They had real problems to navigate with their people. And they also, by the way, and we talked about this ad nauseum, but pagans were not just people who didn't believe in the Torah. It's a very different worldview, as Rabbi Peter said last week. Pagan cultures were very violent, and they did things that were often very flagrantly against Torah values. Death, and I don't go into it, not on Shabbat. But you get my point. So all of this came up in everyday life. So Babylon was a mechanism, I think, the way I read it. Babylon taught us some ways of navigating this space, which became useful. Again, synagogues, how do you interpret a text, right? I guarantee you the rabbis weren't just going into the scroll and saying, here's what it says. There were actually systems that they were teaching each other. Teachers were teaching students, and you see that throughout the rabbinic literature as well. Calendar observances, that was another big one. How do you celebrate the holidays without some traditional background?
There's something that happened in Babylon that's really important for us to understand. I was speaking to a friend earlier this week, and that was kind of, I guess, an eye-opening moment for him. But one thing that Babylon cured is idolatry within Israel. Up until Babylonian captivity, the number one sin that Israel struggled with is worshiping idols, believe it or not. It was the number one thing that prophets always spoke about. But you don't hear much people criticizing that after Babylon. That experience, that painful experience of exile, cured. So while the world was still wrapped up in idolatry, at least most Israelites did not struggle. The lure of the idols all of a sudden is broken. And we have other problems, but that one we figured out.
And, just to add on to that, which is perfect, that was a solution. The tikkun was exile, and that is also why dealing with the Romans and the pagans, the purity it's weighted with the idea that, hey, we just went through this bad experience. Let's be super pure this time. Let's make sure we don't go down those paths again. All those fences were being put in place.
Well, if you read the prophets, what's interesting is they always kind of point to this centralization problem. You have this temple that is the center of all civic and religious life. And then the further and further you get out from this temple, the more idolatry happens. It's like it radiates only so much control. And so when Ezra and them, they come back from the exile, it's like, let's establish these synagogues so there's actual local enforcement of Torah versus just relying off the temple cult alone to carry all that weight. It seems like that delegation actually helped keep Israel from idolatry.
Beautiful. And what's interesting is that we benefit from that every week. We benefit from that work, that Jewish tradition. Because we come, no matter what our culture is around the world, we're all reading the same parsha. We all have a general idea of what a service is going to be like. So it's funny to me in the Messianic movement when people say, we shouldn't be reading the rabbis. Well, how are you doing this every week?
It's accountability.
Accountability, yeah.
In a sense that's still the thing. Like if people grew up in a really small town, and if their kids want to go out and misbehave, it's like your neighbor will see you and then will tell your parents. And then everybody, it's like you have a smaller community where you have these pockets where everybody knows each other and everybody is assigning to say this is the way we're going to live.
Yep.
Then you have a higher accountability to how you behave. And
Yep.
that's what's important. Yeah.
The moms control society.
Or even just beyond necessarily a sense of control and consistency, humans are social. We depend on connection and closeness with each other, and the closer we can be together, then we are the body of Christ. We are the temple. We all put together create that encounter with him. And so the more you can encourage that to happen at that personal level, not abstracted across much distance, then your ability to encounter the realities of God in your midst, I think, is greatly improved.
Yeah, I like that. And probably not where you're going with this, but it does remind me that a lot of the New Testament, we'll just say the Gospels, a lot of the Gospels, Yeshua isn't teaching a new religious maxim that forms a new religion. He's building a teaching that's already, it only makes sense on the foundation of that halakhic tradition. You've heard it said, right? But I'm teaching you. He's using what's already an accepted, normal foundation, and he's building on top of it, and I have an example. Go ahead.
We discussed this before, but when he would say but, he would usually and. Right. Like it was in addition to this.
Yeah.
Because he was building fences, and in many cases, he was further building fences. So
He added to.
he added to,
Yeah, he only added 2. And he also, some of these verses, we'll talk about these maybe next week, I'll add them in. When he said, listen to what they teach you because they sit on the seat of Moses, that is we talked about this a couple years ago. I don't know that video exists on YouTube anymore. That is a huge statement people skip past. Even in this setting, he understood who had the transmission authority. But he also said to his students, you can bind and loose, you can permit and forbid. So he understood how this framework went together, even in pre-Mishnaic times. He wasn't saying, forget those guys, do whatever you want to do. Now that's what some people heard centuries later. But he was in even a framework, a very normal framework you will see in that volume back there. Go ahead.
And he wasn't an outsider, or they would have just said, who are you, get out of here.
Yeah, Pharisees saw him as somebody that held their level of purity and their level of stringency, and they, yeah. So here's an example. I've been threatening this. Here we go. There's a prohibition on images, right? And we know this Judaism tends to have a hard time with putting images on things. Where do they get that idea from? Well, the Torah forbids the use of images or forms, as they're associated with idolatry most often. It's also, irrelevant to this case, forbidden to bring dirty money, I'm calling it dirty money, into the temple. Where you got your money from, what its influence is like. So if someone goes and they, I'm not going to throw examples out. Use your imagination. Someone gets money through ill-gotten gain. You can't throw that into the temple, right? That's a problem. Especially, and this is another side issue, if it has nude images on it, right? Like the Roman coins did. They would have Caesar's image. Or they would have these Ferrier coins, which were very lewd. Torah, absolutely against Torah. In those days, you would have those in your hands if you paid for something and you're a religious person, you might get money back. Now you have this money. What do I do with this? The questions of the everyday people, what do I do with money that has idolatrous images on it? Right? I know where it came from, I know where it's going, I'm looking at the coin itself. What do I do? Can these be used in the temple? What do you think? It's money, right?
You overturn the tables and bring a whip.
Well, that's a whole different story. That's another, and that's coming up, but that's a whole different story. Okay, so no, you can't throw these in the temple. These have to be exchanged. So they had the shulchanim, these money changers who sat at the table, and they would take your coins from Rome and your coins from Phoenicia, wherever, and they would swap them out for a Tyrian shekel. And that Tyrian shekel is what you then take in and offer. Beautiful, right? They've removed the idolatrous coins from going into the temple. And those are the money changers. But I thought the money changers are evil, right? No, that's an assumption. They weren't always evil. There are times when they might have had an exchange rate that was over and above what it should have been, for sure. But the institution of a money changer prevented those coins from going into the temple coffers.
Yeah, so there's of the sayings of Yeshua, there are many that didn't make it into the canon. And so the one that's most repeated that didn't make it in is actually be like the money changers, rejecting much and keeping the good.
Yeah.
And so there's actually reason to think that he put them in a position of praise when they acted like they were supposed to.
Yeah, so the money changers in general are not evil, even though they got their some of them got their tables flipped, and I like to think some of them were like, I wasn't doing that. But in general, there's that assumption again that the money changers are bad. Okay, so good. I get there, I travel in for Pesach, and I'm going to change my coins out. I unfortunately get there on Shabbat. Can I change my coins on Shabbat? No, because you're handling money on Shabbat. These questions are, right? If the Romans do evil things with my money, am I in trouble for that? And the last one, what do we do when the government has laws that disobey Torah? All these things come from this everyday question. Go ahead, Beth.
I heard a sermon and said that the problem at that time too was they shorted the people, that they came in from the diaspora because they couldn't carry what they needed, and it's Pesach and they come all this way and they want to worship and then change their stuff, and now they don't have enough. And it's not just bad because they cheated, but it's bad because now they can't worship. They can't buy the lamb. And so the problem is it's a direct stumbling block, and it's a direct forcing them to not worship the way they want to, or impinging on their worship, with getting in the way of them worshiping the Lord according to the Torah, according to the Word. And that's terrible. So money changers might not be bad in general, but those people at that time doing that thing, that was bad.
Yeah, for sure. It's almost in the vein, it's related to charging interest against your kinspeople, which is against the Torah. But then go back to the leadership, the Herodians and all the leaders and the Sadducees. That's the kind of ship they were running. They were taking these institutions, and was it Caiaphas, who was one of the richest people through that time period? Hold that idea in mind though for the end, because I want to come back to that at the end. Did I see another hand? Go ahead, Izzy.
Also, you said idolatrous imagery on currency. We also, in America, we have idolatrous imagery of the founding fathers and their faces on the currency. Would that be considered dirty money?
So I'll show you. I'll get to that in a second here. I do want to show you Israeli coins. As far as I know, Peter, they don't have images on them still.
Not people's faces,
Not people's faces.
some of those items.
So the rabbis came to a conclusion. Okay, and obviously the shulchanim were there, and we're going to do our best to try to like swap those coins out. Can't let those bad coins go in. But basically, and I think I have it on the next one. Yeah, I do. So for everyday people, what do you do? The rabbis decided, taxes are a reality. Pay the taxes, right? Pay the taxes. You're going to have to. It's not like you want to do it. Not all the coins were actually idolatrous. Sometimes they're just decorative. And that became a big debate between the rabbis. When is it idolatrous and when is it decorative? It's really blurry. Someone needs to discuss that.
That too. He said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. If they didn't go fishing and get money out of fish.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's where we're headed. So some took it on themselves. I'll pay the taxes, but I'm not looking at them. I don't want to see them. Right? So the rabbis came up with these ideas. Very ingenious. And they actually agree with Yeshua. The rabbis agree with him. Taxes are a part of life in the empire. They use the money for roads. Some of these things we benefit from. Bathhouses, that's a whole other issue. But don't gaze upon or admire the coins with the idolatrous images. And then you could say, hey, Rabbi, which one's idolatrous, which one's just decorative? You had that kind of ability. You weren't reading a book, leaning on your own understanding. And many discussions exist around this. Vessels, buildings, right? Public works. And you realize, oh, these are real issues every day. People want to know, can I walk across this road that has these idolatrous mosaic tiles built into it? Or can I cross this building? There are a lot of discussions like this, and they're actually good, practical discussions that everyday people were probably asking. And I also want to say the Talmud, too, seems to be at like kind of the leadership level discussions. I don't know that everyone would be given the same discussion, but these are real questions, which is why someone came, as you mentioned, in Matthew, and they said, should we pay taxes to Caesar, right? Now you know the background to his answer, right? And that, of course, this is more than just paying taxes. This is about the idolatry. This is about the images on it, and he calls it out. Whose inscription and likeness is on this?
Right.
Now, his answer, by the way, is not halakhic in a real sense. He's giving an opinion, but he was not on the seat of Moses in his time. He was giving a very good opinion the rabbis agreed with. Where did he learn that from? What do we do when the rabbi's opinion aligns with his? It's not such a bad tradition anymore, right?
But the way you could interpret that essentially is just keep the common money out in the street and keep the good money in the temple. Essentially, is what he might be saying.
Yeah, and we don't have a lot more to that, right? It doesn't exactly explain verbatim.
It fits with Judaism as a whole. Though.
Absolutely.
Segregation, separation,
Yep.
profane from holy. It fits the whole general thought.
Right, which is the point. It's his advice is often inside the framework. He's not leaving the framework. He's inside of it.
And you did have the Sicarii, or the basically the assassin kind of group of Judaism. That's not referenced by Talmud. It's not referenced by a lot of folks. Josephus talks about it, and this would have been in direct opposition to that group, who would have been trying to violently overthrow Rome and do so by military means, like regardless of what the time was. So this was actually in disagreement with another sect of Judaism, and so like you do have him clinging to one side of Judaism, not another, even in this passage.
Yeah, again, intra-Jewish discussion. That's where we could go very long on this kind of topic. Yeshua's answers are built upon the assumption often of one school of Pharisees or the other. There's not much that I've found, nothing comes to mind, that's completely outlier to it. It's inside one school or the other. Sometimes it's Shammai, sometimes it's Hillel. He might have his own take on it, but it's on the foundation of an existing argument. Which is interesting because then, as I was doing my research for this, I started getting ads for this Temple Coins company, and I was like, maybe not, right? Like, so it's just funny. It's just something comical. Okay, another one: tithing on produce. The Torah commands that we tithe on the produce of the land, right? And it gives very little information about which we tithe on. What constitutes something you tithe on and something you don't tithe on? How do we know the difference? If we're tithing on weeds, my yard, right? Like some of them have flowers, some of them like what do we? Or do weeds count? Did weeds exist then? I don't know. But failing to do so is a sin. It brings us to these questions in the rabbinic tradition. How do we know which plants need to be tithed on? Can I snack on the food before I tithe it? So if I'm tithing blueberries, can I eat a few of those on the way? Or do I have to completely leave that with the temple and then I can have the rest of it, right? At what stage are these ready to be gathered and harvested? Are you going to give them like pre-ripe stuff, or do they have to be ready to go? Or obviously not right, like rotten. Is this plants everywhere or only in Israel? How do we know? Right? And then again, what about produce? These are some questions. Grown in a pot versus in a field. If I'm growing tomatoes in a pot in Israel, do I have to give 10% of those, or does it not count? And these are actual things. Some people didn't have land. They were growing in like whatever space they had. So in the first century, there's a rabbi named Nachum the Mede, and he suggested that there is a certain type of dill that is actually subject to tithe. It's not like the other dill. This is a wild variant of dill that actually has a pod, and people were eating it. And it probably said, hey, someone said, hey, what is that? Or where did you get that? Like, oh no. Like, do we have to tithe on that? It looks like an actual vegetable. So there's a big discussion about it. And the opinion was eventually overruled later. It doesn't tell you when it was, but it seems down the road, maybe years down the road, they overruled it. What does that sound like to you? Where have we heard this?
Tithing mint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you tithe on mint and dill. Like, interesting.
He also ends that passage by saying you should do the greater things, but not neglect those other things that you were doing, which is interesting.
Yeah, he wasn't saying that tithing is bad. And a lot of times you'll see this, Yeshua is saying, do those things, but don't forget the spiritual component of it. We did a big teaching on Mark 7. I'm probably going to have to bring one of those in because I couldn't find the teaching. It was the idea of hand washing. Yeshua's not saying don't wash hands. He's saying don't lose the perspective of why we're doing what we do. Don't build fences that take away and actually cause us to violate what we're actually supposed to do. But this is a contextual background from the first century. Maybe there were people who continued to tithe on this type of deal. And while they were doing it, they just were not upholding the more musar, interpersonal elements of life. But you'll see these all throughout the tradition. Real quickly, we have a little time. I'll wrap this up. All these groups, remember 24 groups, all more or less perished or blended into this last remaining group, which, as Brad said, survived into the next century. So all these groups, they kind of got crushed in that Jewish-Roman war. And in the ensuing generation, there was the Hadrianic oppression, there's the Bar Kokhba revolt. There was a lot of stuff going on that by the mid-130s, you were down to really one main group of people who were trying to preserve this tradition. All these other groups, Essenes, Sadducees, Qumran, these groups, we don't see them anymore. Even Jesus' native, local Galilean Hasidim, they're not really around. And if they are, they're probably blending into this surviving thread. Even the Messianic movement started to blend into the normative rabbinic world.
There was survivors from all of those groups, but they all blended in. They all got in step with the Persians.
They realized we're in a new era, we got to stick together.
This is consolidation. This is not like survival of the fittest, like you think of it that way. It's actually consolidation. The same exact thing happened with the tribes. You hear people speaking about lost tribes. they didn't just make a wrong turn and get lost. They blended with the existing tribes. They lost their unique identity as a cohesive, sort of say, freestanding group, but that doesn't mean that they didn't go on by joining others.
Yeah.
When it comes to the Pharisees, though, I mean, I could see why they would survive in the sense that, like, the Sadducees were so invested in the structure of the temple itself, whereas the Pharisees were out amongst the people trying to, let's bring holiness to everybody and that kind of thing. And so it's like, well, I could see them being the sort of lifeboat. They would have the academics, but they would be decentralized enough that a destruction of a capital wouldn't be what takes them down. So,
I think we wouldn't exist today in this movement if it weren't for the work they did in the century, the 10, 15 years after the destruction of the temple.
Rabbi Foreman had an interesting Bava Matzia kind of unpacking on Rav Zadok and the Tanur Shalachnai, the big debate about the carob tree and the aqueduct flowing backwards and all that. But he talked about Yavna when all these Pharisees gathered together, and he said, okay, we have to have this sort of constitutional convention in which we reform Judaism for the time that's to come, and we have to make a lifeboat because we don't have a state anymore. We don't have a temple anymore. We don't have a capital anymore. And so it's almost like the premise of Battlestar Galactica, where like there's the tiny arc of a ship, that's trying to find another Earth to settle on or something. That seems to be kind of the image that's conjured. So what they came up with was, I think, prayer, acts of loving kindness, and Torah were the three pillars upon which Judaism would stand in the absence of a state, a temple, or a capital. So.
Yeah, they prepared us for the exile. So, again, they're often seen as bad guys. We wouldn't have Torah today. We wouldn't, like, this is so underappreciated, the work that they did to preserve everything that we've come to assume as normal and just default. And this is a tragic time in the first century, and pretty much all of the events of the New Testament took place in this tragic time. Now, the work that they did later would solve a lot of the problems that we see here. Resolve most of them. Some of them we're still not sure what to do. But that's telling, right? And there's Judaism's reboot. I have one more, but go ahead.
I can't state how miraculous I think that this actually is. Because, I mean, like, I heard a stat, and I don't know if it's true or not, but, like, out of all the manuscripts and literatures of the ancient world, we only have, like, 2% now or something like that. It's something very small. Like, I would like to have the rest of Homer. There's a lot that isn't there, and I'll never know it for the rest of my life.
Never made it.
Never made it, the epic cycle. And that's true of a lot of literature. And so it's like when people always thought, like, when the Romans built or burned the library at Alexandria, that, like, all this literature was lost. No, but that's not how it was lost. It was lost just by a slow drip over the centuries of people stopping making copies. That's all that happened. It was sort of a languid...
the Dark Ages.
Yeah. It was just a general lintor through which people just kind of stopped caring about the sacred text, and then it was all just lost. And everybody just at some point looked around like, wait, what happened to Diogenes? What happened to Homer? What happened to, too late. And so this is actually pretty amazing.
It is. And I think the church was influenced largely by the synagogue setting later, right? We could say that a lot you could draw lines back to even Christianity having taken some influence from this era. The new charter, Judaism was no longer engaged in these to the death, I'm not saying that literally, but you get my point, discussions. Now we got to prevent sectarianism. Shammai and Hillel, we look at both of those opinions and we come to a consensus. Now we got to figure out how to keep Torah in exile, living among pagans, and we have to figure out how to do this and teach the next generation. Of course, Mishnah, so some time went by, they argued, they debated, they suffered Roman persecutions, and kind of reluctantly they had to start writing things down. That's when we get this idea, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Gemara. I had someone once tell me years ago, I've read all the Jewish books, I know basically what that says. That's incredible. He's probably 30. I think he probably doesn't know exactly how many books there are. But there's this idea that, okay, we've got the tradition largely captured here, but there are questions. Okay, so let's answer some of those questions. Hey, we have more questions as time goes on. Great. Continue, right? And I would say the Gemara, even though it's not adding any more volumes, we don't have all of them. And we also have books that are compendiums to help you understand all of that. So, and here's what I want to leave you with. Majority of the New Testament happened in this window. Very tumultuous time. A snapshot of sectarianism and turmoil. Judaism hadn't quite gotten its feet under it yet. Most of the world knows and assumes it understands Judaism and Jews and rabbis from this window of time, even smaller. These discussions in this 3 years, and some of Paul's discussions, which in itself are kind of an anomaly. But I want to look at this. There it is. In all of the time from, call it Abraham to modern time, this is the window of time Judaism is judged by. Now, have these people looked at the rabbis? Have they gone deeply into the text, letting it take them where it goes? Have they looked at it impartially? Or have we looked at it through polemics? Have we looked at it through preconceived ideas and notions and attribution error, like we said? So, my last question is that, what if the key critiques Yeshua had with certain leaders of his time were resolved in that next generation? What if a lot of those arguments were resolved and he actually found agreement with where they landed on them? How would that change things? How would that change our impression? So that's it. Next week we're going to go into more of these examples. Any questions?
You marked the temple's destruction. Do you think that the temple's destruction is of more value in this analysis than like Bar Kokhba?
I think I see them as one big
Okay.
block of destruction.
Okay.
They're related to me.
That window of time that you mentioned, is that like 1948 era, or can you?
Oh no, this would be like this would be the 1 century.
Okay.
Because
30 to 70.
like the 1st century, call it.
Okay.
Like all the way back to
Okay.
time of the patriarchs.
Yeah, patriarchs. Because on the Hebrew calendar, Yeshua came on the scene around 3700, and we're in like 58, 100. So he came pretty far down the road, on the Hebrew calendar.
Right. Okay. Thank
But
you.
that's it. That little window of time is the 1st century.
Okay. Very good.
Not a question, I just wanted to point out that anti-Semites like to say that Israel is a secular state, and that's one of the reasons Christians should not support it. But Israel would not be here today without the work of the rabbis. The secular people that founded Israel did that, they're the children of the pious.
Ironically, that's the objection of some ultra-Orthodox sects, is that they're a secular state too. So.
How long does it take for a secular person to repent? How long? Not long. That's what we look for.
All right. So.